the many aircraft that fought in the aerial battles of the Second World War, one German plane would become legendary, serving as the main backbone of the Luftwaffe's fighter force until the arrival of the Focke Wulf 190 in 1941. It was the most advanced and capable fighter platform at the time of its introduction in February 1937. With its all-metal stressed skin construction, enclosed cockpit, mono-wing design, and retractable landing gear, it was a favorite for the pilots who flew it, and a menace for those who faced it in aerial combat. My name is Liam Smith, and this is the story of the iconic Messerschmitt Bf 109. Welcome to World War Military History. After the conclusion of the First World War, the once mighty German Empire was forced to sign a treaty that was, in the eyes of many Germans, humiliating and harsh, the Treaty of Versailles. This, in effect, reduced the armed forces to only 100,000 men, the loss of territory to other countries, and to pay a massive £6.6 billion in war reparations to France and Britain. The country suffered from hyperinflation and political instability. This was fertile ground for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Under the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, Germany was forbidden to have an air force, but over time, civil aviation slowly re-emerged, and several smaller outlines came together to form the national airline Lufthansa. The first test aircraft was the passenger transport M20. Unfortunately, the M20 had a nasty habit of crashing and killing its test pilots. After initial failures with the M20 aircraft, designer Willy Messerschmitt took the opportunity to start an aviation company of his own in March 1926, Bayerische Flugzeugwerk, or BFW for short, but not before making an enemy of the Lufthansa director Erhard Milch, who had lost a close friend in one of the M20 crashes. This feud would last for decades. When Hitler and the Nazis consolidated their power in 1933, they spent millions on a rearmament program. One of the components of the new German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was a state-of-the-art fighter aircraft. The German Ministry of Aviation invited 4 companies to submit a design for an international air racing competition. They were Arado, Heinkel, Focke Wulf, and BFW. This was a highly sought-after prize, and every design was skillfully put to the test. In the end, Willy Messerschmitt's sleek and relatively small aircraft, the Bf 108A, would outshine the rest with its superior agility and ended up setting a new airspeed record. Although coming third in the competition, Messerschmitt set to work on developing another fighter aircraft, the Bf 109. An interesting fact is that the Bf 109 was referred to as the Me 109 by Allied aircrew and some German aces, even though this was not the official German designation. The first time this iconic German fighter plane was officially unveiled to the public was in 1936 during the Berlin Olympic Games. These games were very controversial since the Nazi Party was governing the state. The Bf 109 was one of the many spectacles that unfolded during the games. 14 pilots dazzled spectators with a presentation of the highly advanced fighter aircraft. This was truly a sight to behold, and very likely helped solidify a sense of fear of the Nazi regime, which was making huge strides in military technology. On the 11th of November 1937, the Bf 109 would set an international speed record of 610 kilometers per hour. Design of the new fighter aircraft commenced in March 1934, and the first official prototype was designated as the Bf 109V1. It was completed in May 1935 and, quite ironically, was fitted with a 695 horsepower British Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. This was because the power plants supplying the German engines weren't ready in time for trials. It was not until the second prototype, the V2, that the first Humo engines became available. The V3 soon followed and was the first Bf 109 prototype to be fitted with a pair of 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns. To accommodate the machine gun ammunition boxes and access hatches, a unique ammunition feed system was designed. A belt consisting of 500 rounds was fed along special chutes out to the wingtip. This was passed around a roller, which led back beneath the gun breech to the wing root, and then to a second roller, which fed the ammunition back to the weapon. However, in 1936, German intelligence had learned of a British fighter that was fitted with 8 303 Browning machine guns, the Supermarine Spitfire. Thus, the armament of the Bf 109 was vastly upgraded, with 2 cowl-mounted 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns, which carried 1,000 rounds each, and 2 20mm MG-FF cannons mounted in the wings. Here are a couple of photographs that I was able to find showcasing the layout of these two weapons. The 20mm cannons were an immense improvement in firepower, as in later variants, they could fire a steel cartridge exploding mine shell, and could fire at a rate of 750 rounds per minute. The cannons had to be mounted further along in the wing. A large hole was cut in the spar, which allowed the gun to be fitted with the ammunition feed. Each cannon carried a 60-round drum magazine, which was placed in a space closer to the wing root. This caused a small bulge in the underside of the wing. To compensate for this minor problem, a small hatch was incorporated into the bulge to allow access for changing the drum magazine. The entire weapon could be inspected for servicing by removing a leading-edge panel. For an extra punch in firepower, an additional 20mm MG-FF cannon in later models, the MG-515 cannon, was fitted into the engine and fired through the propeller shaft. This was also known as a motor cannon. The placement of a 20mm cannon into the engine itself I found to be highly fascinating. Essentially, the engine that powered many of the Bf 109 models was the Daimler-Benz 600 series. This engine was inverted, unlike the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that powered the Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane. The 20mm cannon was mounted behind the engine and partially positioned through the engine shaft. It was aligned so that it and the ammunition that it fired never touched the rotating hollow shaft, and there was room for the gases to be expelled. Although this was a very effective and deadly accurate weapon, some of the top Luftwaffe aces such as Adolf Galland disapproved the addition of the cannon mounted in the engine because the vibration of the engine along with the recoil and overheating of the gun in earlier models sometimes caused it to jam. Besides its lethal armament, the Bf 109 was packed with an array of fascinating features. A modern design that was incorporated into the fighter was the automatically deploying leading-edge slats. These slats would automatically extend when the aerodynamic forces over the wing dictated. This allowed the aeroplane to make much tighter turns and to change the lifting performance of the wing to better enable maneuverability. However, not all pilots favored these automatic wing slats when in a dogfight, and a high-speed load on the wing could sometimes cause the aircraft to stall. The Bf-109 had a very narrow track undercarriage, as this was placed under the fuselage. This presented a problem for pilots when taxiing or landing. Ernst Merrin, who flew the 109, said, "In my opinion, one flaw was that the undercarriage was by the fuselage, and sometimes, for example during takeoff, the aircraft would pull to the left. We had many accidents because of this. In comparing the 109 to the Focke Wulf 190, its undercarriage was on the wings, and there was a wider span." Coping with the Bf-109 on uneven surfaces was extremely dangerous, and trainee pilots were often killed whilst attempting their first flight. Roughly 1,750 aircraft were lost to undercarriage accidents during the war. However, once in the air, the Bf-109 was an excellent flying machine. The wings were very light and could be disassembled and reassembled quickly. When laid along the fuselage, the aircraft took up a remarkable small amount of space. This made it ideal for transportation by rail or road. The fuselage was sleek and sinister, whilst the enclosed cockpit was a little restrictive. Behind the head of the seat was a steel plate which protected the pilot's head from damage. The first engine that powered the Bf-109 was the UMO-2110, which produced only 690 horsepower. To improve performance, a much more powerful engine was installed, the Daimler-Benz 600 series inline engine, which produced 1,050 horsepower. This would increase in power output during the course of the war. The Daimler-Benz was an inverted engine, unlike the upright Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane. Instead of a float carburetor, the Daimler-Benz had a highly advanced fuel injection unit, which produced a much speedier response on the engine and allowed the pilot to undertake negative G maneuvers without the fuel being cut off. This was a flaw that was present in the earlier Spitfire and Hurricane models, which I will discuss in depth later in the video. The Daimler-Benz also had an automatic variable speed supercharger that enabled more power output. For example, in the Bf-109E3, this gave it a 200 horsepower advantage over the Spitfire Mark I. And to conclude this chapter in the video, I just had to finish with the sound of the Daimler-Benz engine. You already got a taste of this awesome sound at the beginning of the video, but I wanted to play it again for you warbird enthusiasts. The first variant of the Bf-109 that saw official combat service with the Luftwaffe was the Bf-109B or Bertha. It was powered by a UMO-2110D engine, which produced 690 horsepower and sported a two-bladed fixed-pitch propeller, which was later changed to 3 blades in the D variant. It saw combat in the Spanish Civil War as part of the Luftwaffe's Condor Legion. This was a group of military volunteers that assisted the Spanish nationalists who operated under General Francisco Franco against the Communist Republicans. 2 other variants of the Bf-109 would also see combat over Spain, the Bf-109C or Clara and the Bf-109D or Dora. The Dora model would be fitted with the new Daimler-Benz 600A engine, which produced 1,050 horsepower. Thus, the nose of the aircraft had to be lengthened to accommodate the new engine. The war in Spain proved to be the perfect testing ground for the new fighter aircraft, and pilots began experimenting with new tactics, gaining the edge over the Russian aircraft. The most important tactical development in the Spanish Civil War was developed by Werner Mulders. the Finger 4 formation. Around the world, all the air forces were using a fighter tactic called the WWII, a three-plane formation in the shape of a triangle. The main drawback to this tactic was that only the lead plane could search the sky for danger. Instead of the WWII, German pilots spaced out their aircraft and added an additional fighter, forming a pattern that resembled the fingers of an outstretched hand. If forced to split up during an engagement, the Bf-109s could break into pairs, with both leading aircraft receiving separate cover from their wingmen. The Finger 4 formation could act offensively in a dogfight, whilst at the same time it could defend itself from enemy attack. It allowed the German fighter pilots to dominate the skies over Spain. The Bf-109 was clearly the best fighter of the Spanish Civil War and the best fighter in the world at that time. The Bf-109E, or Emile as it was called, is considered to be the definitive version. It was the first mass-produced variant and made its appearance in October 1938. The aircraft was powered by a Daimler-Benz 601 engine, which produced 1,050 horsepower, and it had a maximum speed of 570 km per hour. It was armed with two wing-mounted 20mm MG-FF cannons, two cowl-mounted 7.92mm MG machine guns, and one 20mm MG-FF cannon firing through the propeller shaft. Over 200 Bf-109s participated in the invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. The Luftwaffe's casualties in Poland included 67 Bf-109s, with most of them being lost to ground fire. The Bf-109E enjoyed considerable success throughout France, Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Over 1,000 Bf-109s were deployed to support the German advance, and in less than a week, France had lost more than 3/4 of its total fighter strength. On May 23, 1940, the Bf-109E would face against RAF Spitfires for the first time. The Spitfire would become one of the Bf-109's deadliest adversaries throughout the course of the Second World War, particularly during the Battle of Britain. As the British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, RAF Hurricanes and Spitfires engaged in several dogfights with the Bf-109. Spitfire ace Douglas Bader recalls one such incident.
I shot one fellow down at Dunkirk. He must have been a beginner like myself, because he stayed flying absolutely straight and level while I shot him down, without moving. We didn't have air superiority, but we had enough. The Germans left Dunkirk and went on to Paris and so on, which was a great mistake of theirs, really. We lost quite a lot of airplanes at Dunkirk and some jolly good pilots. But they managed to get back quite 300,000 men, I think, from the beaches. There was a lot of people. It was absolutely dead calm sea.
Despite the evacuation of Dunkirk being a success, France had surrendered, and the skies over Western Europe were dominated by the Luftwaffe. The only country that now stood in Hitler's way was Britain. On July 16, 1940, Hitler prepared for the invasion of the British Isles, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. In order for the invasion to be successful, the Luftwaffe had to achieve total air superiority and crush the Royal Air Force. Nazi Germany would rely heavily on the Bf-109 to escort the bomber formations, something that it was ill-suited for. Bf-109 ace Adolf Galland explains.
Our bombers and Goering himself, they have ordered us to stay with the bombers at the same altitude, at the same speed, and as close as possible. I said they wanted to have a little German fighter hanging on the wing. This could not be done by us because we were far below our cruising speed. The bombers were slow in formation. They had a lot of bombs hanging outside. This has lowered their speed also. And in addition, they were trying to go higher than their best altitude because of the English anti-aircraft.
The goal of the fighters was to lure the RAF where they could be defeated in aerial combat. However, the Bf-109E had a major flaw. It only had a cruising range of 410 miles and roughly 15 minutes of engaging the enemy. The German fighter would be racing against time to return to base. Of 12 Bf-109s returning from one mission, 5 barely crash-landed onto French soil. The other 7 ditched into the English Channel. Due to the limited range, some Bf-109s would venture alone over the English Channel to lure foolhardy RAF pilots back to waiting comrades circling near the French coast. When the Luftwaffe fighters crossed the channel with the little fuel they possessed, the dense English radar system ensured they would be greeted with a hostile welcome. These systematically established radar towers could detect aircraft over 120 miles away, thus providing the RAF with an advanced warning of enemy aircraft. During an aerial dogfight, the Spitfire could outturn and outmaneuver the Bf-109, but the Bf-109 could outclimb and dive faster than its British adversary. Another technological advantage of the Bf-109 was the fuel injection system in the Daimler-Benz engine. The main issue of the Spitfire's Rolls-Royce Merlin was that it consisted of a float carburetor. When the aircraft performed a negative G maneuver such as pitching into a dive, fuel would flood the throttle valve, and the float would be forced downwards. The Bf-109 fighter pilots quickly caught on to this particular engine flaw because black smoke would puff out from the engine whenever the Spitfire flipped over. The engine would only stall out for a moment, but during a dogfight, this was all a Bf-109 needed to escape or get onto the tail of a British fighter. To negate this issue, Spitfire pilots would have to perform a split-S maneuver. The flaw was eventually addressed by Beatrice Schilling, who placed a small brass ring into the engine to restrict fuel flow to the minimum amount necessary. Although it wasn't a complete solution to the problem, it allowed Spitfire pilots to perform negative G maneuvers without the loss of engine power. Eventually, when the Battle of Britain concluded in late October, Germany had lost over 1,700 aeroplanes, including 610 Bf-109s. As the war spread throughout the Middle East and North Africa, the Bf-109 was specifically adapted in order to cope with the harsh and dusty conditions. Thus, in order to prevent damage to the engine, a sand filter was placed over the supercharger air intake. This tropicalized version of the fighter aircraft was known as the Bf-109 Trop. In my personal opinion, this variant of the 109 has the most unique looking camo design. Here are a couple of rare color photographs. Eventually, in June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Spearheading the attack was the Bf-109. Whilst many of the aircraft consisted of the Emil, a new variant entered the fray, the Bf-109F, or Friedrich. It was powered by the Daimler-Benz 601E engine, which produced 1,175 horsepower. This model also flew in the North Africa campaign and incorporated a number of vast improvements, many of which resulted in the fighting experience gained in the Battle of Britain. The F model had consisted of a much larger 3-bladed propeller spinner and a redesigned engine cowling reduced air drag. This gave the aircraft a much more sleeker appearance. It also possessed rounded wingtips, which enabled a higher service ceiling than the E variant. The F-Series abandoned the wing cannons and concentrated all armament in the forward fuselage, with a pair of synchronized machine guns and a 20mm MG515 cannon firing through the propeller shaft. During the first 2 days of Operation Barbarossa, Bf 109E and Fs shot down over 300 Russian aircraft. The F variant of the Bf 109 served in almost every unit of the Jagdflieger and produced the highest scoring aces on the eastern and western fronts. On September 1942, whilst flying an escort mission in Africa, Hans-Joachim Marseille, the Star of Africa, set a record in a Bf 109F when he destroyed 18 British fighters in a single day. During the whole of the month, he managed to shoot down 62 machines, and by the time of his death on September 30th, 1942, his personal score was over 158 British aircraft. But this number was nothing in comparison to the top 2 scoring aces of the Luftwaffe. They were Gerhard Bachorn, 301 kills, and Erich Hartmann, the Blonde Knight of Germany, 352 kills. Both of these pilots flew in the fighter wing JG-52, and all of these kills were exclusively in the Bf 109. These numbers are indeed staggering. They are not just big by German standards, they are the highest scoring aces in the history of aviation. Hartmann's experience as a fighter pilot spanned 3 decades. In World War II, he flew over 1,400 missions and had combat in more than half of them. Unlike Allied airmen, Luftwaffe pilots had no rotation system during the Second World War, which is why they were able to rack up so many kills, and why so few of them survived. Despite of its excellent performance at high altitude and high speed, the Bf 109F was never fully produced in large numbers. It was during 1941 that the Bf 109 was considered to be substituted by a new and excellent fighter aircraft, the Focke Wulf 190, also known as the Butcher Bird. Some call it the best German fighter aircraft of the war. The Bf 109 and the Focke Wulf 190 served both on the east and western fronts. The 190 had many advantages, such as better armament, landing gear, and visibility, but many Luftwaffe pilots still preferred flying the Bf 109. In May 1942, the Bf 109F was eventually phased out by the next 109 variant, the Bf 109G, or Gustav. This model of the Bf 109 was produced in large quantities and was powered by the Daimler-Benz 605 engine, which produced 1,455 horsepower. The cockpit had bullet-resistant glass, and some were pressurized or unpressurized. It also consisted of a much better armament than the F model. There were over 10 variants of the G series, and the fastest of these was the Bf 109 G10, with a top speed of 690 km per hour, and with a service ceiling of 7,500 meters. In later models, the Gustav was fitted with 2 13mm heavy machine guns, 2 Gondola 20mm MG515 cannons, and a powerful 30mm Mk108 motor cannon. As a replacement to the 20mm cannons, the Gustav could also carry 2 tube-launched 21cm WGR rockets, which were used against bomber formations or ground targets. Under the fuselage, there was room for a 500kg bomb or 4 110kg bombs. Under the wings were 2 300 fuel drop tanks, which could be jettisoned when depleted. When fitted with the 13mm heavy machine guns, the Bf 109 had 2 large blisters ahead of the cockpit over the breech blocks. This gave rise to the nickname Bump. However, this armament and new engine power came at a huge cost. It was much heavier than the previous variant and less maneuverable. The maximum weight of the aircraft, when fitted with the armament and bomb load, was 3,650 kilograms, in comparison to the F model, which was only 2,900 kilograms. By the end of the war, Messerschmitt, along with other subcontractors, produced a staggering 13,000 aircraft. The Gustav was eventually followed by both H and K variants, but neither of them surpassed it. Whilst the Gustav performed well as a high-altitude interceptor against Allied bomber formations, they couldn't compete against the overwhelming Allied air superiority. By 1943 and 1944, the American daylight bombing campaigns had drastically increased, in bombing factories and infrastructure to disrupt German supplies. Many of the Bf-109 fighter units were withdrawn from other theatres in defence of the Reich. Whilst I was researching for this video, I came across some extraordinary rare colour film of American B-17s under attack from squadrons of Bf-109s. This footage was absolutely intense.
Fighters, 60 109 at 3 o'clock. Keep after him, would you?
I see him. I'm on him. Come on, use him. There's 4 of them. 1 o'clock high.
They're coming around. Watch them.
Two fighters, 6 o'clock up, coming in. Diving out, Chief.
B-17 in trouble out at 2 o'clock, watching.
Got an engine on fire.
There's 2 more diving through the 94th.
3 planes, 9 o'clock, coming around. Keep your eye on them, boy.
I see him.
2 at 2 o'clock. Watch them, Scotty.
I got my sights on him.
Check that B-17, Chuck, 3 o'clock. Loader smoking. Fighters, 10 o'clock.
Watch those 2 at 12, Ben. They're coming in.
They're coming in, Scotty.
Get that ball turret on him.
They're breaking 11, breaking 11.
I got him.
Watch that fighter coming in at 3 o'clock.
He's coming in a half roll. Pull her up, Chief, pull her up.
B-17 out of control at 3 o'clock. Keep your eye on him, Bill.
See any parachutes, Quinlan? Come on, you guys, get out of that plane. Bail out.
There's one. He come out of the bomb bay.
Yeah, I see him.
There's a tail gunner coming out.
Watch out for fighters.
After the conclusion of the Second World War, the Bf-109 remained in foreign service in countries like Spain, Finland and Romania well into the late 1950s and early 1960s. The Bf-109 still remains the most produced fighter aircraft in history, with a total of 34,248 being built. Some of the Bf-109 construction was infamously produced in concentration camps through forced labour. In the end, the legacy of the Bf-109 is twofold. One is the incredible story of a fighter designed years ahead of its time, but at the same time, it was an icon that served a truly dictatorial regime. Thank you so much as always for watching. I really enjoy making these history videos. And don't forget to give us a like and to subscribe for more content. Until then, stay tuned. I'll see you next time.